Good evening, board members. This is Pedro Castro and Jason Madel. We want to go over some information in regard to the Dean's Office. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the Dean's Office and our philosophy. Our goal is to create a restorative school which incorporates trauma-informed practices and provides successful opportunities for our students. With that, Mr. Madel is going to start us off with some restorative justice information.
Thank you, Mr. Castro, and thank you, board members, for the opportunity to speak to you a little bit about what we're doing up here in the Dean's office. So one of the things we're excited about is this taking on of the restorative justice mindset. And in layman's terms, the restorative justice mindset is an alternative to traditional consequences that encourage students to own their mistakes, deal with them head on, work to repair the harm done, and then move forward without being overly punitive. Why restorative? Why is this an important mindset for us to have? The last thing I said on the previous slide was not being overly punitive, and we feel that that definitely plays a part in the school to prison pipeline that this country is currently dealing with. And when this occurs, the students actually become accustomed to just being punished repeatedly for their wrongdoing. This does not rehabilitate or encourage any personal growth and reflection, which is what we believe is the role of the deans in our school. So one of the things that we've learned about is a small phrase that just simply says, punishment is passive. And that makes sense. Punishment is passive, and in this case, students do not have an active role in their remediation. Usually in traditional forms of punishment or traditional consequences, the student is simply having something done to them or something given to them, versus restorative practices, which allows for an active involvement of the student. So the student would then take a role in their own remediation, hence getting much more out of it. This is something called the social discipline window. The blue portion is the part that we focus on here. The other portions you see 2, not, and 4 refer to the way we deal with not just children and adolescents, but all people. So you can do something to someone, you could do something for someone, or you could neglect someone altogether and just basically not even choose to deal with them. That would be the not part of the window. The restorative portion of discipline talks about the with part of the window in blue there. And when we're talking about the with, we are talking about having high control and high support, which means we have high standards for our students. There are certain things that we will not accept as behavior in a school, but we're not just going to punish them and discard them. We're going to work through the behavior with the student and try to rehabilitate them as best we can so they can be a learning process and they can become better humans for it. So when we're talking about what is called the social discipline window, we do focus on that blue square, the with area. So we've talked a little bit about what restorative practice is. How do we use it? There's a couple things that we need to do when we are using restorative practices with our students. The first thing we're going to do is have them reflect on their behavior. And this is simply something along the lines of what happened. We may ask some more probing questions, but it always starts with what happened. That allows the student to know that they're being heard and they're being given a chance without interruptions to tell us from their version of events what happened. The second part is probably the most important part, and that is to acknowledge a wrongdoing. We're not really able to move forward with our restorative practices if the students are not willing to admit some type of wrongdoing, or maybe a better way to put that would be just what their role was in this. So if a student is not going to be willing to acknowledge that they played a role in whatever the situation is, it's really hard, if not impossible, to restore. The third portion of this is also very important. That's make amends. This gives the student a chance to put themselves in someone else's shoes. If they did something inappropriate in the cafeteria, they could possibly work alongside a cafeteria worker to see what it really is like and how difficult that job can be. And that will hopefully create empathy, which is the crux of most of what we do up here, which is seeing things from the other person's point of view and becoming a more caring, compassionate person when it comes to learning from our previous behaviors. And a final portion of this, which is equally as important as the other ones, would be welcoming back to the community. So too many times our students may make a mistake, have an error in judgment, may do something silly, and they feel like that's it. You know, they're done. They can't recover from this. And this fourth area of restorative practices really addresses that head on. It shows the students that, yes, you've made a mistake, you can make a mistake, you can move on from it, and you're not just discarded. We don't just throw you away. We bring you back into the community. In this case, we bring you back into the fold of the school. We kind of try to get you involved again, and we just move forward. We don't hold grudges. We hold you accountable, but then we're able to move forward from it. So there is a format that we follow. Mr. Castro and I have gone through a significant amount of training, and these are the questions that we are given, and many times we do not stray from these questions. We ask the question, and then we allow the conversation to just breathe. We allow the individuals that we're working through this with to just talk themselves through the entire scenario. So it starts with something as simple as what happened, what were you thinking at the time, what have you thought about since, who has been affected, in what way have they been affected, and what do you think you need to do to make things right? And if you look at those questions, those all address some of the points we talked about a few slides previously, where we're just talking about reflection and thinking about how something that we did affected others. So what does it look like? We've talked now about what it is and why we do it and how to do it. What would restorative practices in our school look like? Well, there's actually what's called the restorative milieu, which goes basically from the low-end version, which is the shortest, the quickest version of restorative practices, all the way to the most involved and most time-consuming. So what we have here is an affective statement, which is simply being able to tell somebody, you know what, you did this and you made me feel this way. Could be positive, could be negative, but that is on the low end in terms of how much time and preparation something takes in terms of restorative practices. The statement that is just telling somebody how what they did affected you. In the middle of that restorative milieu that I mentioned, kind of in the center there, would be a small restorative conference. And that could be something that would be set up possibly even the same day as the incident occurred. And that would involve mostly just the individuals that were involved in an altercation or an argument, whatever the case may be. So it could be something as simple as Mr. Castro or myself leading two students who got into an argument through that series of questions and helping them come to some type of reasonable conclusion to it and being able to move forward and just go back to class that day. On the far end of that restorative milieu that we talked about in terms of how much time it takes to set up and how involved it is the large restorative circle. This circle is going to involve a fair amount of people. It's going to involve somebody like a counselor or Mr. Castro or I or a social worker as the person that's going to lead the circle. It's going to include the individuals that were involved in the incident, whatever it was, but it's also going to include people to support the students, in our case, that were involved in this incident. It's also going to bring in people that were directly affected by it. So a circle like this may be 10 to 12 people in total. It is time consuming. It takes a lot of prep work. And that's what makes it the most challenging, especially in the school setting, because we're all pressed for time a lot of times. However, it has been shown to be very effective because what it does is it allows everybody to see everyone else's point of view. And it really gives people a chance to come together after some, what we've seen, at least in our experience, is some pretty hurtful instances. So it is effective. It's just time consuming. And like I said, it just does take a lot of preparation. So we do need to talk about the fact that our first priority is always the safety of all of the students in the school and the building itself. So we are all about restorative practices. We believe in it. However, there are some things that in our setting, it's not reasonable to try to restore because of the egregiousness of I'll call it a violation, I suppose, or misbehavior. Things such as egregious violence, a sexual crime, or a distribution of some type of controlled substance. We do not believe that it would be reasonable for us to try to restore this type of behavior in the building. It wouldn't be responsible to the rest of the student body. So there are things like this where a student may have to be removed from our school and placed outside of our school setting. And we believe very strongly, though, that that is the only option when it comes to things such as these things that are on the screen right here. So we like to be restorative whenever we can. We believe in it. We feel very strongly about it. It works. It's effective. However, we're also realists, and we do know that not everything is restorative, unfortunately.
So with that said, I'm going to start taking us into Senate Bill 100. There is a lot of information here, but you'll notice that the Senate Bill 100 information ties in quite a bit to the restorative practices. This actually, well, restorative practices have been out for quite about 20 years or so. Senate Bill 100, I believe, was 2016, September 15 of 2016. And they go hand in hand in that Senate Bill 100. Actually, it tells you here. But I did want to mention this. There's a lot of information here. I won't go line by line, but know that we will provide this PowerPoint to you so you'll be able to look at it from the whole thing from the beginning to the end. But I did want to give you some of the information. For example, the purpose behind the Senate Bill 100 is to reduce, if not eliminate, exclusionary practices. The things that Mr. Middle was just talking about now. We don't want to just remove students just for whatever reason. So through this bill, the Senate Bill 100, we reduce the number of students who are removed out of school, and we've done that quite a bit since the inception of this. And those board members who were here prior to 2016, we actually started this one semester early because we were ready to go. So we pretty much put it in effect here, and it was a pretty smooth transition. And we've just been building upon that. And the restorative practices now that we've made as part of the fabric of what we do in the dean's office has a lot to do with Senate Bill 100. So it does eliminate zero tolerance policies that we used to have in the past. If a student, for example, who had fentanyl, if a student were caught with drugs, it was an automatic 10-day suspension from school, out of the building. And as far as the educational supports that we have for the student, it was not existent. And the intention of me saying that was not to say that someone is at fault for doing this. It's just the way it was. So we're moving away from that. And again, with the restorative justice of bringing students back in the fold, I've committed an error. What can I do? First of all, acknowledge what I've done, and then what can I do to be able to repair the harm and then come back? That's the basic principle within the restorative justice, to bring students back into the fold and say, we're not shunning you we're not shunning you because of an action that you've done. So what is exclusionary discipline? It is suspensions, expulsions for gross disobedience or misconduct. Currently, Senate Bill 100 is set up between two different types of suspensions, from 1 to 3 days, and then from 4 or more days, 4+ days. But for either one of these in the Senate Bill 100, it's the crux of it, the rationale for any suspension is the threat to another student or to another staff, or what we call imminent threat. If there's an imminent threat that a student is causing to another student, to a staff, or to the building, causing fire or something like that, those are what would warrant an exclusionary measure, suspension from school. And for each of those, there are two suspension forms that we have. One is a 1 to 3 and the 4 to 10. We have to be able to explain how is it that if a student, for example, were to be suspended for 4 days, why would a student need to be suspended for 4 days? Why wouldn't 3 be able to do that? Or serve the consequence, or be able to address the issue. For example, what we do now when students, if any students are under the influence, again, it used to be a 10-day suspension. We do send the student home that day because they are an imminent threat, even though sometimes they'll say, I'm perfectly fine. But they're an imminent threat to themselves or to others. So we have a parent come pick them up, they go home. The following day when they return, they will go into an ISS. So, and again, think about what used to be 5-10 years ago, where it was an automatic 10-day suspension, which could be reduced to 5 if they were to go to some kind of drug treatment. This changes that quite a bit. And again, to put students back in the building, to keep them in the building as much as we can. We do provide re-engagement to return to school plan. which is if they've been gone for the 1 day suspension, or a 3 day or a 4 day, whatever the case is. And actually, to date, I don't believe we've ever had anything more than 3 day suspension. I believe everything has been within that date range. But we do provide a re-engagement where they'll meet with myself, they'll meet with their counselor, and basically what we do is we talk about those restorative questions that I've got pinned here on my wall. What happened? What were you thinking about when it happened? What have you thought about since then? Who has it affected? Again, to re-infuse the restorative practices as best we can to bring the student back in the fold. I'll go on to the next one. So the 1 to 3 day suspension, and basically, did the student engage in a gross disobedience or misconduct, again, that created an imminent threat, either to themselves or to others. Just as a point of clarification, we have had physical altercations that did not necessarily result in a suspension. Would probably end up resulting in an in-school suspension, but those are few and far between, where Mr. Madel and I, or either individually or the two of us, are able to meet with both students and basically we resolve the issue. It just is a misunderstanding, and they both come to that same agreement on that same day. However, if we try to have that conversation with those students and we fear that something may happen the next day, that constitutes an imminent threat. So therefore, we might keep one or both out the next day, again, a cooling down period. That is what goes back to the imminent threat. And if we were to need to go more than 1 day with an out-of-school suspension. And again, a threat of safety to school safety, disruption of other students' learning opportunities, even if a student chooses not to do what he or she is supposed to do for that class, if they are not disrupting others, then that's where it involves dean intervention. And then we also have to be able to document what that threat is. So I can't just say, I feel he's a threat, just because. We have to document that, and then that goes in our school form. The 4 to 10 day exclusion or expulsion, and those are some of the things that Mr. Middle talked about now, the more egregious sexual misconduct, gross disobedience, any kind of major harm to the school, or sexual misconduct. We've had, unfortunately, incidents where we had to address something along with this, but we don't do expulsion. I can proudly and honestly say we have not expelled a student in over 8 years, I want to say, and we do everything we can to avoid that. That is the last resort, and we haven't had to use it in a very long time. But again, it's students who pose a threat to safety of other students, staff, members of the school community, or where they disrupt or impede or interfere with the operation of the school. And of course, at the very end, I have to be able to document the threat or the disruption. I can't just say, this is what I feel is going on, therefore the student's going to be out for X number of days. Then this is our last screen here. This is just to give you an idea. Some of the more major offenses, the more egregious offenses that Mr. Middle talked about, possession of a firearm. And I put up there, federal law trumps state law, because that does. The federal law says that this is what's going to happen. State laws, as you guys already know this, they are secondary to the federal law. So that's currently a state law. Violence towards staff, bomb threats, possession or distribution of drugs, that is what could lead to possible expulsion. Even though we haven't done an expulsion in about 8 years, we do everything we possibly can so as not to get to that point. Now, when we start talking about suspensions, 1 to 3, actually 1 to 10, depending on the severity of these infractions, threats of violence, extreme cyberbullying, fighting, gang activity, possession or under the influence of drugs, possession or under the influence of alcohol. Other possible consequences, where we then incorporate things like in-school suspensions, lost Tuesdays, parent conferences, student conferences. Those are things like bullying, harassment, and then here we can also now incorporate restorative conversations with other students to get them all together. Vandalism, if we're able to get a student to put him or herself in other people's shoes and see how the action that they did harmed somebody else, that's a win-win. Theft, profanity, disrespect, insubordination, cell phone policy violations, things like that. Those wouldn't necessarily warrant out-of-school suspension, because those do not, in and of themselves, possess or create an imminent threat for somebody else, or other student, the building, or staff. So, all in all, this has been a brief overview of the restorative practices that we use here in the building, Senate Bill 100, where they came from, then how both of those tie in together. As I mentioned when we first started off, we also try to keep the trauma-informed practices as the backbone, because there are things that are going on. Mr. Lazarevich had mentioned before in speaking with students. Students come to school with two backpacks. It's what we see here and then what's going on at home. By having a trauma-informed lens, we can see or consider other possibilities to why students' behaviors might be manifesting themselves in the buildings. Hopefully this has been of use to you. Feel free to get in touch with either Jason or myself if you have any questions. Mr. Madel, any final comments?
No, just want to say thank you for your time. And if that's it, I guess we can go ahead and say good night.
And again, we will share the PowerPoint with you, so you'll be able to look at it from beginning to end. And any questions from there, feel free to reach out to us. Have a good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.